Simon, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a business suit, being in a good mood, was going to a business meeting. Putting folders with documents into an expensive leather briefcase, he was happy as a child that fate had sent him Paul. Everyone could only dream of such a partner because he was so skillful in handling business, and the income for the year of their partnership had increased significantly. Simon was already over 30, and he seriously thought about having a family. He did not support the modern tendency to have children when you have grey whiskers, except that there were some difficulties with the candidates for the role of his wife. The man saw through them and more than once arranged a test of their feelings for him. And all his girlfriends failed miserably, showing that they were only interested in his money and position. Simon needed a modest and decent woman who would think of the home and love him first, not his money. So, thinking about everyday life, Simon finally left his apartment, once again checking whether he had all the documents. Stepping out on the street, he looked up at the windows of his penthouse with pleasure, and then went to his fancy car sitting in the parking lot. Suddenly he felt a slight touch on his hand. Simon looked around and saw a poorly dressed girl, about 8 years old. By her appearance, he immediately realized that she was a common beggar. Simon prepared to hear her ask for money, but instead the girl said something that made him stunned to sit down on the bench and think hard. It was out of the question to go to the meeting with Paul now. Many years before these events, Simon's life had been radically different from the present one. He was not rich, lived with his mother in a small, cramped apartment, and worked in an ordinary position as a programmer in a small computer company. However, it did not upset him, because he had something much more precious in life: his beloved girlfriend Elizabeth, whom he had already proposed to. Elizabeth lived in a nearby town, which was surrounded by beautiful mountains. It was a simple tourist town, and Elizabeth, who was a primary school teacher, could not find work here. She lived with her grandmother and was going to leave for the capital of the state after her marriage to Simon to start a new life in better circumstances. But the young woman could not imagine what role her grandmother would play in what happened next. Mrs. Torres was already over 70 years old, and she loved her granddaughter and wished the best for her. However, Simon did not inspire confidence in the old lady. She did not see him as a reliable protection and support for her granddaughter, because in his youth he had problems with law enforcement authorities. He had been a troublemaker and was on the police list. Although many years had passed since then, and Simon had long ago straightened up and had a good profession, Mrs. Torres still believed that one who had violated the law once could do it again and again. This was the elderly woman's opinion, and she was not going to change it. So she repeatedly told her granddaughter, "Dear, you will grieve with the gangster. Leave him while it's not too late. Look how many good, hard-working men are around. They will carry you in their arms, but you are clinging to this Simon as if he is smeared with honey." "Oh, Grandma, why do you say that? Simon loves me very much, and I love him. What was in his life is long gone, and now he is completely different," replied Elizabeth. In general, the grandmother and granddaughter could not find a common language, but fortunately it did not come to a major problem. Everyone just stuck to their own opinion. Elizabeth would have most likely followed her beloved, but one day they went for that unfortunate walk which was fatal for them. On that wonderful summer evening, nothing foretold disaster. Simon and Elizabeth were going for a hike along a mountain river. When they arrived at the start of the trail, the weather changed slightly, and the sun disappeared behind the clouds. But the two lovers were so busy with each other that they did not notice anything around them. The air was filled with the wonderful aroma of greenery, and Simon and Elizabeth, holding hands, walked along the forest path, discussing their plans for the move. Looking shyly at his beloved, Simon said, "We'll rent an apartment first. My savings will be enough at first, and when we find a place to live, I'll start looking for a job. It's good that I have some income from remote work. I do not think that there will be problems with finances. I hope you do not have to work. After all, it is the duty of men to provide for their family." "Simon, I believe that everything will be fine, but I'm worried about grandmother, how she will be alone here," answered Elizabeth, squeezing the hand of her beloved in her little palm harder. "Well, what's the big deal? We'll settle down and then take her to our place. I like her. I see that she is a very intelligent person, and she has a good sense of humour." To avoid upsetting him, Elizabeth did not tell her fiancé what her grandmother really thought of him. As they were talking, the young people finally noticed the rain, which had barely begun to fall, and turned back. But the weather was deteriorating at an alarming rate. Not 5 minutes later, the downpour was like a wall around them. The couple were halfway back to their car when there was a terrible rumble in the mountains above them, and the ground trembled. Nature seemed to have gathered all her strength and brought down a mighty torrent of mudslides. It swept away everything in its path, approaching the place where the couple had stopped with unbelievable speed. Unfortunately, it was too late for Elizabeth and Simon to escape. In a matter of seconds, the pair were swept by a mudslide straight into the river. The turbulent stream swept them both up and untied the hands of the lovers, who only had time to shout words of love. Several days passed. As best he could, leaning on a stick, Simon hurried to the house of his beloved. He had injured his leg in the mud flow, hitting the stony bottom of the river, but still managed to get out on the bank. That's where the rescue team found him, and they took him to the hospital. Simon was mad with worry over Elizabeth, so when he was released from the hospital, he immediately went to Elizabeth's house. But the door was opened by Mrs. Torres, dressed all in black. Simon was pale in horror, but he had no idea that the elderly woman had noticed him from a distance and quickly changed her clothes. "What's with Elizabeth? Where is she?" whispered the young man. "I warned Elizabeth so many times not to go with you, and now she's gone," shouted the elderly woman with hate. At these words, everything swept in front of unhappy Simon's eyes, because he felt guilty about the death of his beloved. It was his idea to go to the mountains, as Elizabeth had suggested sitting in a cafe. Simon sank to the ground in shock and dismay. Muffled sobs shook his shoulders, and the elderly woman relentlessly hurled curses at him, after which she slammed the door, saying that he did not even deserve to see Elizabeth's grave. Unable to endure such pain, on the same day Simon left for the capital of the state, sinking into himself for a long time. But he had no idea that everything his fiancée's grandmother had told him was a lie. All this time the injured girl was in the hospital, very near to her fiancé, and she knew nothing about him until Mrs. Torres told her the same story about Simon, saying that he had been swallowed up in the mudslide. The elderly woman resigned herself to the necessity of lying for the sake of her granddaughter's well-being. After Elizabeth was discharged from the hospital, She was grief-stricken at first, but she eventually pulled herself together, because now she had someone to live for. She had Simon's child under her heart, but she decided not to tell her grandmother about this, because the elderly woman had a weak heart. Unfortunately, Elizabeth did not have a chance to tell her grandmother. Apparently, the pensioner was punished for her mean deed, and she did not live a month after that, dying of a heart attack. Of course, Elizabeth could not live in a town where she had lost 2 of her closest people in such a short time, so she sold her house and, in the same way as her fiancé, went to look for happiness in a distant city. It had been 3 years since Elizabeth gave birth to her daughter Chloe. All this time she lived in the dormitory of the cannery, where she had worked as a common labourer. The director was kind enough to help her and gave her a room. The young mother lived off her allowance, savings, and odd part-time jobs. And then Elizabeth entered a real bad streak of bad luck. It all started when Elizabeth became friends with one woman. She was very kind, compassionate, and quietly gained Elizabeth's confidence. The woman found out that Elizabeth was all alone in the world and dreamed of having a house of her own, and offered to help her buy one. Unfortunately for Elizabeth, she trusted her, but the woman turned out to be a swindler and tricked her by registering the house in her own name. The appeal to law enforcement agencies had no result, since the swindler had thought of everything. So, overnight, the mother and daughter were left without savings, and then they also found themselves without a place to live, because the cannery went bankrupt, and the dormitory was closed along with it. Elizabeth had nowhere else to go but to church, where she often went to pray for the repose of the souls of her beloved and grandmother. Despite all the misfortune, the woman had not lost her faith, and her prayers were heard, and she was helped. A kind elderly man was sent to help her. He lived in the city in his own comfortable apartment, but in the village an hour away from the city he had a summer house in which no one lived. The elderly man offered it to the mother with the child in her arms. Since then, Elizabeth and Chloe began to live in that village. The years went by. Elizabeth worked as a kindergarten teacher in the city. The salary was not enough, and they lived modestly. Since Elizabeth wanted to provide her daughter with a good education, she did her best. So she took part-time jobs to put some money aside for the future. Chloe was a precious child, beautiful, swarthy, and gypsy-like. Seeing how hard her mother worked, one day she decided to help. The girl had attended music school, and now, instead of waiting for her mother after school in a nearby square, she took her flute with her and went to play in the crosswalk. Passers-by took pity on the little beggar and often put coins and small bills into her hat. Thus, of course, the girl could not help her mother much, but she still believed in the best. One day, Chloe was walking to the crossing and noticed a shaven-headed man getting out from under a car parked nearby. He took his jacket from a friend who was standing nearby, and they walked away as if nothing had happened. Chloe walked a few meters away, and the men paid no attention to a little girl who looked like a beggar. "Well done," said the man who had climbed out from under the car. "Now his car will blow up as soon as he goes to negotiate with his partner. What a fool! How can anyone trust a man like Paul? He was in jail for a reason. Come on, stop babbling. He pays just fine, and the rest is none of our business," replied his accomplice, looking back at Chloe. But when he saw that it appeared to be some little gypsy girl, he immediately lost interest. The men continued on their way, while Chloe ran quickly to the car to wait for the owner. Simon was quite surprised when the little beggar told him not to go to the negotiations because some men had put something in his car that would make him blow up. To be on the safe side, Simon called the police, who removed the timer from underneath, counting the last minutes of his life. While they were waiting for the police, Simon had time to question the little girl about where she had come from. The little girl told everything as it was and showed him a photo of her mother. Simon's heart fluttered. Elizabeth was even more surprised than Simon when an unknown man called her and thanked her for the fact that her daughter had saved his life, saying that everything else was settled with the police. He would personally deliver Chloe home. Paul and his accomplices were arrested on the same day. Never would Simon have imagined that his companion, being such an honourable man, could do such a thing for the sake of money. In the evening, terribly worried about her daughter, Elizabeth was amazed when an expensive car drove up to her house, from which her daughter emerged triumphantly. A man followed her out. Shocked, Elizabeth immediately recognized him. It was her Simon, alive and unharmed. The lovers rushed into each other's arms, Chloe standing beside them, not knowing yet who this man really was. "Will you marry me?" was the only thing Simon could whisper. "Yes," she replied. The poor woman and her daughter had to endure so much, but happiness returned to them. She did not hold a grudge against her grandmother, knowing perfectly well that she wanted her happiness. When the whole family spoke at the elderly woman's grave, a small cloud suddenly covered the clear sky, and a few drops of rain fell from it. And maybe that was a sign that Mrs. Torres was asking forgiveness for what she had done.